start with ritual. I welcome everybody to the former West Virginia Penitentiary. This prison opened in 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War ended. And it was in operation for 129 years until it closed in March of 1995. Now, when this prison was in operation, the Department of Justice named this as one of the most violent prisons in America, in the top 10. As far as deaths go, we were very high on the list as far as numbers of deaths, the total number of deaths that took place inside this building. I like to make comparisons. Everybody has heard of Alcatraz, correct?
Yes, sir.
San Francisco. They had 28 documented deaths in the years that their facility was open. Everybody's heard of the Mansfield Reformatory, right, in Mansfield, Ohio. They had about 215 or so documented deaths inside that building. Here in Moundsville, West Virginia, in the West Virginia Penitentiary, we had 998 documented deaths inside this building. That is one of the reasons why this is thought to be one of the most haunted places in America. So, the deaths of the inmates were sometimes violent, sometimes natural causes, but there were a lot of murders, a lot of violent deaths. Those seem to be the ones that stick behind, seem to communicate with those that come in here to investigate. I'll give you names of inmates that died inside this facility in hopes that you might use that on your investigation to try and capture paranormal evidence. But we did have inmates that died at the hands of the state, inmates that died because of the crimes they committed. We had 94 state-ordered executions. 85 men died by hanging, and 9 were executed in the electric chair, which the electric chair is still here on display in the museum there, just off of the lobby. You can take a look at that, take pictures of that later. That is the real electric chair that was used to execute these men between 1951 and 1959. So, that is a very important part of that history, but also the violent deaths that took place. The state of West Virginia abolished the death penalty in 1965, and there were no more executions beyond that. Every death beyond that, as far as the violent deaths go, was usually at the hands of the inmates. Inmate-on-inmate violence, stabbings, beatings, even shootings inside or just in front of this penitentiary took place. Inmates shot by the officers, inmates shot by one another, or even law enforcement officers shot by the inmates. So, all of that happened here. We're going to start this tour by showing you one of the largest cell blocks in the West Virginia Penitentiary. It is called New Wall. New Wall has 320 cells, and what is so special about this block is you can go all throughout this cell block. Upper tiers, middle tiers, lower tier. So let's go over here and check that out. Follow me. Into these areas. But you are now inside New Wall cell block. New Wall was general population, and that meant when the inmates first came to this facility after 1959, when they put this cell block into use, this was where they would have a cell, where they'd be assigned a cell. The only inmates that would not be assigned a cell in New Wall cell block, just after 1965, or excuse me, just after 1959 to 1965, they add another cell block called South Hall, and that was where the death row cells were. So, for those times if any inmate was on death row, they'd be housed in South Hall. But after the death penalty was abolished in 1965, they tore out South Hall, and this became the only general population cell block in the West Virginia Penitentiary. The only other inmates that would not be assigned here would have been the pedophiles, child molesters, and informants, snitches, would be housed separately in a separate cell block called protective custody. This has 320 cells, and you are welcome to explore all of them in this cell block. Meaning the upper tiers, and with the upper tiers, before I get into any stories of the history or the paranormal claims, that means I have to give a disclaimer. Do not fall over the railings and off of the upper tiers of this cell block. It's not the fall that gets you, it's the sudden stop at the bottom, so a little science fact there. But, as long as you're safe, you shouldn't have any issues. It should be pretty hard to fall over the railings. But, we don't want anybody to get hurt tonight, and that's why I bring that up. Now, this cell block was used from 1959 to 1995, and this was their home. These 5x7 cells were the only place that they would inhabit, that they could call their own. Now, the only problem was they had to share it with another inmate. 5x7 cells, you had 2 inmates in each cell, a top bunk, a bottom bunk. That is one of the reasons they shut this prison down. They said it had inadequate space. That, combined with a lot of other complaints that went all the way through the West Virginia Supreme Court, they deemed this prison to be a violation of the 8th Amendment, and they claimed it to be cruel and unusual punishment to house inmates inside this prison. This cell block saw a lot of history over the years. This being the place where they lived, this would be where they'd come back, where they'd come home every day. When they were locked inside these cells at times, the disputes between cellmates would become violent. Fights, beatings, stabbings, and even murders would take place in some of these cells over the years. Now, the most interesting of that history was probably during the riots. There were very violent riots that took place in the West Virginia Penitentiary. One in 1973, one in 1986, and they were centered from this cell block and then expanded through the prison. The riot in 1973, there was an inmate named Willie Hale that was violently murdered in this cell block. Being a very public informant for the facility, the inmates found him, brought him to this cell block, they stabbed him to death, they decapitated his body, put his head on a spike, and put it in front of the windows here, so that everybody driving past could see his head, his decapitated head, through the windows. That is why now, in this cell block, there is a second pane of glass, second layer of glass on the outside, that you cannot see through. That is a result of the 1973 riot and that incident with Willie Hale. Now, in the 1986 riot, you had 3 inmates that were murdered. An inmate named Jeff Atkinson, an inmate named Richard Dean, and an inmate named Kent Sly. So, Kent Sly got the worst of it. Not only was he an informant, but he was also a convicted child molester and child killer. So not only did they stab him upwards of 40 to 50 times, multiple inmates stabbing him at once, but they also, before they threw his body down the maintenance stairs and into the basement where the body was to be released to the DOC, but they cut off his private parts and put them in his mouth because he was a child molester and a child killer. So these inmates made these murders, they committed these murders to make a statement. It wasn't just about eliminating that inmate. It was about displaying to the other inmates, showing them, if you're an informant, if you snitch on me, this is what's going to happen to you. Take a look at this mutilated body. This is what's going to happen to you. It was a show of power, it was a show of intimidation. And that's how these inmates operated. So that's just very few examples of something that happened many times in the history of this prison. Now, this cell block is thought to be one of the more haunted parts of the prison because this was everyday activity. They always came back to this cell block. People have seen shadow figures sticking their heads out of the cells. You look at this vantage point, standing up close to the bars. Notice how it goes all the way down. You can get a good look at that solid flat plane. I've had people say when they were looking in that way, they actually saw a shadowy head pop out of the cell and look down at them. They followed the cells down and looked into that cell after that head disappeared to find nobody was in that cell. I've heard whistling coming from this cell block, various points, multiple times, even talking, speaking, and also shadow figures. There's also been claims of footsteps. Now, some of the footsteps people sometimes claim to hear the rattling of keys, and I think that might be from a murder that took place in 1973 when a correctional officer was murdered. The officer's name was William Quilliams. He was 80 years old. He walked in on a drug deal, and an inmate named Bobby G. Jarvis stabbed him 18 times and murdered him. He was one of 4 officers to die inside the West Virginia Penitentiary, so keep that in mind. I'll be mentioning a few more of them as we go through our tour. Now, any questions about the cell block? There are multiple sets of stairs to get up. There are 4 separate blocks. We are on K block right now. J block is on the other side. M block is straight down, and L block is on the other side of that. Probably some of the more violent deaths that we had, inmates actually were allowed to smoke in this prison. That meant they had access to matches, lighter fluid, and cigarettes, and also lighters, of course. There were times in the history of this prison, 2 of them happening in this cell block, where an inmate was thought to be an informant or an inmate had a vendetta against one of their fellow convicts. And they doused them in lighter fluid, set them on fire, and they burned to death inside this cell block. Happened twice. So all of this, of course, is information that you probably want to know for your investigation, because that is what the paranormal is, trying to contact the spirits of the dead. So, any questions? Let's head back out into the hallway. We're going to walk by the stairs down here so you can see where those are. This is the shower, by the way. Shower 9 inmates at a time. And there are 4 of these structures throughout this cell block. You'll find 3 more of them. All right, everybody, you are now out on the south yard. This was the general population recreation yard, so that meant the inmates that were in New Wall, when they got out of their cells every morning at 7:30, they were allowed to stay out of their cell until 10 o'clock p.m. They had a lot of different activities they could take part in. They could either apply for jobs and get work detail, where they could work from cleaning the prison to automotive shops to maintenance shops to plumbing repair shops. There's a lot of different things the inmates could do, and they'd be paid for those jobs. But some of them were more apt to want to, of course, play sports. We had some very talented athletes at this penitentiary, from playing baseball to football, even softball, basketball, And they had competition not only with their fellow inmates, but also outside teams would come in. Whether they were other penitentiary teams, the correctional officers would sometimes form teams, or even local recreational or semi-professional or professional teams would even come in and play the inmates in some of these sports. This was the area on the yard where the inmates had the most contact with one another, and as a result of that, that meant this is the area where the most beatings, stabbings, violent attacks, and murders took place. They happened out here on the yard, the most of them, than any other area in the prison. Although, as you all know, it is kind of difficult. It's more difficult to investigate outdoors than it is to do paranormal investigations inside. But that means while you're out here, you can have the opportunity to explore this yard. The only area you're not allowed to go on this yard is down in the wagon gate on the far end, on the southern end down there. Don't go upstairs. You can go check out the inside of it, but the stairs are locked off. But by any chance that you're able to get on the stairs, don't go up there. That's an area that you don't have access to simply for safety reasons. But there's a lot of activity on this yard, and that means while you're out here on it, just enjoying the cool evening air or having a smoke break, because the smoking area is right over, if I can find the button, there. That is the smoking area at those tables, so if you're having a smoke break, you can still investigate, and that's the beauty of the West Virginia Penitentiary. No matter where you are in this building, you are literally within feet away from where someone died or someone passed away. So, even at those tables, just about 20 feet away from that, there was an inmate right in front of the chapel that was stabbed to death. He had a piece of a broom handle shoved directly through the center of his chest, and it punctured his heart. So, there was some pretty violent murders out here on the yard as well. On the stairs, which I don't want to blind anybody, so let me move over here. On these stairs, that is where an inmate named James Hall was actually murdered by two members of the Avengers Motorcycle Club. They stabbed him to death because he informed on their leader. Their motorcycle club president was named Danny Lehman, and that's a name that'll come up later on. After James Hall informed on Danny, Danny ordered for his murder to take place. And on those stairs is where it was carried out. So that's another name you might want to use later. Now, the outdoor recreation area was utilized quite a bit, but it was not as popular, it was not as romanticized as the indoor recreation area. The indoor recreation area was very beloved because there were no correctional officers down there. No supervision at all while the inmates would play pool and ping pong, card games and board games, and that became a huge issue for a lot of the security personnel of this facility. A lot of fights, beatings, stabbing, sexual assaults, rapes, or even consensual sexual activity took place down there. And that's one of the reasons why it was nicknamed the Sugar Shack. Has everybody heard of the Sugar Shack? It was made famous by MTV's Fear, a reality show that was shot here in the year 2000. We're going to head down there in a minute, but I will tell you the stairs that we enter down into the basement to get to the Sugar Shack, that was not where the inmates would go down. Those stairs were actually utilized for an entirely different purpose, because before 1974, right at the bottom of those stairs there were cells, and that was solitary confinement. That would be where if the inmates broke the rules of this facility, the administration would lock them up for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for however long they felt necessary. The reason they completely dismantled that policy, that protocol, was because during that riot in 1973, the one where I told you Willie Hale was murdered, the main demand the inmates had was to eradicate that practice of locking them up down there. They had a fellow inmate that was locked up down there for 5 months straight, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. As we walk by that area, I want you to think, one of our maintenance men, former maintenance men, ended up quitting because of a paranormal experience he had in that area. As he was walking through, he said he heard a man whisper in his ear and tell him to get out now. And he said he even felt the air on his earlobe as this voice whispered in his ear. He quit about a week later. We do have a haunted house, and the Sugar Shack will, in a couple of weeks, it will go under construction. They'll build a whole set down here for our haunted house, so that's why that mask is there.
That's creepy.
Watch your step there. You got a rat coming in. Top of the shit if you don't know there.
there's a bats down here. Yeah, there's a bat down here.
I had to get one in my house a couple weeks ago, and it was hissing at me, showing its fangs. It was scary. Things are nasty. Cat was trying to
Pool tables down here, ping pong. They had tables down here for arcades and board games. They even had couches set up for them to sit down, relax, and enjoy this recreation environment. But as you can imagine, completely unsupervised, those indoor recreation activities could go wrong, and they went wrong many times. A lot of fights down here, beatings and stabbings took place in this basement. A lot of disagreements turned violent, and they were more likely to turn violent because of the lack of supervision. I always like to call this almost like the outlaw land of the West Virginia Penitentiary. There was no law enforcement officer that came down here, so the inmates created their own enforcement system. So a lot of the pedophiles and the child molesters and the informants, they would not be
Camera
allowed
lost focus.
down here. If they set foot down here,
My camera
they would
lost
be in trouble.
focus.
They would be beaten, murdered, stabbed, or worse. Very gruesome stories I've been told, which we have been told we have to spare the details on the tours. That's how gruesome these stories are. So, but I will tell you that this area is known for its paranormal activity. But before I get into that, I will tell you we do have a haunted house in October. So that's why that mask is over there. I'm sure some of you saw that. That's why all of this is back here behind the caution tape. Here in a couple of weeks, they're going to pull all of these props out and rebuild the set that was in here last year for our haunted house. So that is why that's pushed off to the side of the room, and know that that is what that is for. That has nothing to do with the history of the room. But the activity down here ranges from pretty much any type of paranormal activity you can think of. Last night they were really loud. It almost sounded like someone dropped something metallic. It was like a metal pipe, and someone dropped it over here in the corner. And so they had no explanation for it. There was nothing metal in the ground over there, nothing that they could find. Also, people have seen shadow figures, including myself, moving in and out of these pillars, almost like they're trying to dodge your line of sight, which is pretty creepy in and of itself, almost like a very creepy game of hide and seek. But I've also had strange experiences with voices down here, hearing groaning, and then one time back in 2013, we heard, myself and my friends all heard what sounded like a man screaming at the top of his lungs like someone was stabbing him to death. Could not explain that at all. One of our other bosses, his name is Tom.
I like this.
Tom was walking through here and ended up feeling like someone grabbed him by the arm. He said it felt like someone grabbed him around the area of the bicep and stopped him in his tracks. So. We have some people afraid of the dark here. Welcome to the darkest place, well, the second darkest place in the prison. Believe it or not, it's darker than this. So, but there's a lot of creepy activity, a lot of paranormal and unexplained activity down here. Like I said, Tom felt like someone grabbed him by the arm, and he could not explain that. And during our haunted house, a lot of people that work in here, they don't like the sugar shack. They have to spend an entire month every weekend down here. They don't like it. It's really creepy. So definitely come down here and investigate later, but realize right up above our heads right now is the lobby. So anybody walking around up there, anybody going back to take a break for the air conditioning, anybody using the restroom, you will hear them up above your head. So not everything is going to be paranormal. That's something that you should remember. Now, you are in a very famous hallway, and this hallway is not famous for the history of the prison, but rather a piece of paranormal evidence that was captured here. Has anybody ever heard of the Shadow Man photograph? Yep. It was taken in 2004 by a lady named Paula here. It's been featured on Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, Paranormal State, the American Ghost Hunter documentary. The list goes on and on with a number of different programs on television that have viewed or even talked about or tested this photograph. Now, Polly was coming back to the lobby on an overnight investigation just like the one you're on. It was about 1:30 in the morning, and she was making her way back down this hallway towards us. She heard a sound coming from down by the cafeteria that you see at the end of the hallway. As she turned around with her flashlight off, she could kind of see some movement down there at the end of the hallway. But she wasn't entirely sure what it was until she lit it up. When she lit up the end of the hallway, she said, with her flashlight, she noticed there was a figure walking towards her. She said its movements were almost cartoon-like. It looked like a shadow she couldn't see through, and the inside of it looked like moving static. It was so creepy to her, but for some reason she was not scared. She walked backwards down the hallway, right about in between these two red doorways. About 110 feet away from the door, she took one photograph with the flash on her camera. And when the flash went off, she noticed it illuminated the whole hallway. She almost could swear the figure was in that photograph because she saw it when the flash went off. She went home, she took the photograph, brightened it up, and sure enough, in that photo was the Shadow Man. If you have not seen it, feel free to ask me when we get back to the lobby. I have it on my phone. You can actually take a look at that. So, there's a lot of shadow figures seen all throughout this prison. It just so happens this shadow figure that was captured in this hallway is the most definitive proof of this shadow figure activity in this penitentiary. Now, historically, this area was used for many different things. Originally, this is where cell block was. Remember how I told you before New Wall was the only mainline population or general population cell block? There was a cell block called South Hall with the death row cells. That's what was in here. Before these cinder block walls and plaster walls were here, this room was 300 feet long and 25 feet tall. There were 240 cells in here. They were stacked in tiers, just like the cells in New Wall. Just they were a little bit more archaic, did not have the electric motor. They had the manual locking system, so that was the difference there. But this cell block was torn out in 1968, all the pattern being used for almost 90 years as a cell block.
He's gonna probably come over here. It's like the old meeting area where they could touch each other. A riot happened back here too. Hopefully he'll come back there.
The building was no longer structurally safe, so they tore down the old dining hall building and moved the dining hall in here. Again,
This gives me the heebie-jeebies, man.
I didn't know.
Down to the far end on the right-hand side, and the
There's also
serving
like
line was
some
actually
wiring.
in this hallway, right about where the center of my flashlight beam is, where the serving line
Just the
started.
weirdest area that I felt.
But
It's
anyway,
not even
I'll
like
show you
over
what
there
the
either. It's like right in this area.
Yeah,
Now,
right over
this
there.
dining hall was probably after it was put into operation, the most hated dining hall the inmates ever eaten in. So they kind of regretted burning down the old one. But this one in here was absolutely infested with different vermin. They say the rats could grow to be the size of small cats with tails 10 to 12 inches long. It was so infested with cockroaches at night, it looked like the floor was moving. And in fact, the corrections officer, Maggie Gray, reported to many of the other tour guides, she said that when she got home from work, when she worked in this dining hall, she took her boots off on her porch, turned them upside down and shook them so that she could shake the cockroaches out of them before she went into her house. That's how many cockroaches there were in this building. But also there was issues with sewage problems and temperature. It could get over 110 degrees at this dining hall. So they had to build a new one. They built a new cafeteria with air conditioning down at the far end of this hallway. That was actually demanded during that prison riot in 1986. So the 73 riot, the major demand was they eradicate the practice of solitary confinement. The 86 riot, they wanted to improve the conditions of this penitentiary and to build a new eating area. And they did get that cafeteria. During that riot, the head negotiator who sat down with the governor and negotiated the terms of the inmate's surrender as well as the negotiations and their demands was an inmate who was the president of a motorcycle club. Remember the motorcycle club I talked about? Danny Lane. He ordered for James Hall to be murdered. He was one of the most powerful inmates in this prison, and he actually got to sit down face to face with the governor of the state of West Virginia and negotiate those terms. So, they did get a new dining hall for that, and that is when they fully renovated it, basically turned this area into different classrooms and workshops, and a visitation room behind this wall. The visitation room is decorated with ceiling and floor artwork and murals, so definitely check that out later. But I will warn you, in that visitation room, there are sculptures that were done by an inmate. He was paid by the state to make these Native American sculptures for the state park directly across the road. But they were sent back over here because of the graphic nudity. So, I will warn you they're in there, and I will warn you that if you walk into that room and see people crouching in the corner, don't freak out. It's not a spirit, it's nobody alive, it's just sculpture. So, but it's pretty cool to check out. But let's head down towards the cafeteria. This was the first and only place in the entire history of the prison to have the luxury of air conditioning. These vents on the other end of the ductwork, that was the biggest privilege the inmates had ever been given access to because they never had it and they didn't have it in any other parts of the prison. A lot of the cell blocks get upwards of 120 degrees in the heat summer. So to come in here and sit down in a 70-degree temperature controlled environment was huge for the inmates. I think that's why a lot of the strange activity moved into here. The inmate wanted to spend time in this dining hall. It only makes sense that the inmate died in this penitentiary in the operational years that this dining hall was used lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, you can experience something audible, something that can be perceived by your senses that could be the past replaying itself. I actually got the chance to capture that about 3 years ago. We left a digital recorder in this completely empty prison while we went to dinner. There was nobody else in this building. We had the recorder back in the kitchen. And about an hour and a half after we left, it sounded like somebody was still doing the dishes back there. Like they took the hard plastic trays and were throwing them into the metal sinks. It was really loud, very creepy and definitive. It was pretty cool. But I've also heard whistling in this cafeteria. It sounded almost as though someone was strolling across here completely carefree, not a care in the world, just whistling a song. Of course, me being the paranormal investigator, I wanted to basically open the door thinking it was another investigator saying, hey, could you not whistle? We're trying to record to do an EVP session back in the kitchen. Well, as soon as I opened the door, the whistling stopped and this cafeteria was empty. We looked all around, out every door, and even ran as fast as we could to check every possible angle to see if someone was hiding from us, but there was nobody in the area. So, I heard some of you mention the wall with the truck on it. That was where the correctional officers would eat if they wanted to eat the same food as the inmates. They would go and get the same food that was prepared by the same crew of inmates that worked back in the kitchen. The inmates got paid $1 a day to prepare the food, serve the food, and clean up the dishes afterwards in this kitchen area. Now that is where we're going to walk back to right now. I want to walk you back there to show you some of the tripping hazards and some of the things you can expect to see while you're back here. Just be careful on the premise with that. Before we even walk back here, there are outlets sticking up out of the floor. There are some areas where some pipes and even some like gas lines, things like that, they stick up out of the floor and then they're just tapped off and you can easily trip and fall. Also, there's large walk-in coolers and freezers back here where they can store the food. Now, you can go in them, don't get me wrong, you can go in them, just don't shut the door behind you and pull it completely shut. Because the door will latch on the outside and you'll be stuck in it. There's no release on the inside, and that's not a fun way to spend your night in a penitentiary. If you lock the cool. So, let's go on back here into the kitchen so I can show it. That actually would have been in the old dining hall.
The old one?
Yes.
Oh, dang.
Yep, because this wasn't built yet during the '86 riot when Atkinson was killed.
This is where I was staying. This is where he hangs out.
Is it?
Back in there. In that room, they said. It's like his room.
He said that this was the shadow of the shadow of I agree.
I'm gonna go around this way. Because we can scoop around and it'll bring us right back to this area. Yeah.
See, I thought you said how many inmates. That answers that question. If anybody wanted to know, 25 to 30 inmates. You are now in the kitchen, just to let you know, for whatever reason, I think this is one of the most active parts of the prison when it comes to residual activity. I've heard voices back here. I've used the spirit box and captured some pretty creepy voices that weren't really pertinent to anything that was actually being said at the time, but still, references to a lot of the food, sometimes talking about that, talking about different foods that were cooked back here in inside activity. Jason, one night when we were investigating here, Jason investigated with me and
It's another bat. It's another bat.
we were doing it overnight here. Jason was by himself in his kitchen. He started talking about how much he loved hot dogs. And stuff like that. You can try and ask questions that you think would relate to these inmates that once worked here and lived here. So, I once had a really creepy experience back here. This was about 5 years ago. I was up against this wall and I was looking over towards the coolers. Now, there's a lot of people that report seeing shadow figure activity down this hallway. So, I was trying to see if I could see that. But at the time, it was entirely completely dark, and the only light entering this cafeteria and kitchen was through these windows along the back wall. When it's completely dark in here, it's pretty easy to see those windows. So when something moved in front of the windows, it caught my peripheral vision. And I immediately turned my head to look. Beside that, or right in front of that far right-hand window, I saw the full figure of a man walk from left to right. And then as I turned my flashlight on, illuminating the corner, it was empty and there was nobody there. Literally, split second. I saw the man walking in front of the window on the inside, not on the outside, on the inside, and then it was open, and he was gone. So, definitely look out for that type of thing, shadow movement. Laser grids are really good for that. I saw somebody have laser.
So this is where the death houses were, yeah. These two gated areas.
Where's the hole at that we already passed?
The what?
The hole.
I don't know. Maybe it'll show us more.
There's like a, yeah, I know. I was just thinking. I thought it was out maybe in one of the yards, like access through the yard.
Yeah.
But that's crazy. If we have to go through there and get somewhere. Looks like bluish reservoir.
That's what I told him earlier. He said that's the stuff.
Now, the reason I stopped everybody here was because of what used to sit right here. Now, before I talk about what used to sit right here, I wanted to mention these actual bullpens, these fenced-in areas. You have access to these around the other side and then along this long walkway in between the fence and this building. You can access these recreation bullpens. The recreation bullpens were for the inmates in North Hall cell block, which in the later years was used for segregation. A segregation cell block is one where the inmates are separated for some specific reason. Whether it be that they committed a violent crime inside the penitentiary or they just broke the rules and were being punished in some sort of punitive way in that cell block. Or even the administration could put them in what they called administrative segregation because they felt they were too dangerous to be housed in general population. You had a lot of those inmates in there, the most violent inmates in the West Virginia Penitentiary. This is where the gang leaders, the murderers of the gangs, where a lot of them were actually housed. And because of that, they had a lot of gang clashes, gang wars that took place in there. And you have to think about within this small cell block that we're going to enter, just how many gangs were piled in on top of one another. So it is a very small space and tiny cells. But what the segregation included was 23 hours a day they were locked inside their cells. They were allowed out for 1 hour of recreation time and about 15 minutes of shower time. That is it. So the rest of the day they spend in their cells, and we'll talk about that when we get in there. This is where they had their rec time, but before these bullpens were even thought about, before they were put up here, right where this bullpen starts, the first bullpen here, extending out into this parking lot, there was a building that had a wooden frame, 2 stories tall, and that was called the Death House. Can anybody guess what the Death House would have been used for?
Church.
Death. Executions. That's where all the executions took place. All 94 of them took place inside that building. The first 85 of them were by hanging, and there's a lot of stories in there from that. Shep Caldwell was the first man to be executed in the West Virginia Penitentiary, and he was executed in that building. The building was built because of a state law that was passed that said all executions had to be private within the privacy of the West Virginia Penitentiary inside a building where only those invited to view it would witness it. Shep Caldwell was the first of 94. Then in 1931, you had a very interesting execution of a man named Frank Heyer. Frank Heyer actually owned a restaurant down in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, in a little town called Durbin. And he apparently was an alcoholic. And when he became drunk, he was a very violent and angry drunk. Well, one night he and his wife got into an argument over finances of the restaurant, and he started to drink, and he beat his wife to death with a broom handle in the kitchen of their restaurant. When he went to his execution here in 1931, Frank Heyer was at that point the heaviest man to ever be hanged. And the warden actually cited reasons as his soft neck being for why when they dropped him down through the trap door in the floor, the rope did not stop him. His body fell all the way to the ground and his head was ripped right off of his shoulders. He decapitated at the end of that noose. They said blood shot everywhere all over the floor of the death house, and then the warden had to explain to all the people that came to witness why they had to cease such a grisly act, a grisly execution. So, pretty interesting story there. The very next man to be executed was Harry Powers. You talk about a movie in just a real life story, and in fact it was made into a movie. This execution, the story of Harry Powers' crimes, was actually the story that based the book Night of the Hunter is what it was called. And then they made a movie by that name in the 1950s starring Robert Mitchum. So that movie, which is on TNT's top 100 movies to see in your lifetime, that movie was based off of Harry Powers, a real life execution, a real life killer that was executed here. Harry Powers was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. He killed 2 women and 3 children that he lured to his farm using the newspapers. He would promise them wealth, he promised them money, and then one of the women actually brought her 3 kids. All the women he strangled to death, but then the youngest kid he beat over the head with a ball-peen hammer. Killed him that way. Then they buried their bodies along his shed on his farm. Well, they found the bodies, and that's why he was executed here, but what they didn't realize, Harry Powers, under multiple aliases, one of which was Cornelius Pearson, the other of which was Mr. Weaver. He would actually put advertisements in national newspapers for free because he was a member of the Brothers and Sisters Association of America. And he could put these advertisements in what was called the Lonely Hearts section. This is the very earliest attempt at what we now know as online dating. It was in the newspapers back then, though. And he would advertise to these women that if they came to live with him and he promised them marriage, that he would pay them $100 weekly. And that they only had to perform wifely duties if they wanted to. Back in the 1920s and 30s, that was a pretty appealing offer to a lot of women. And apparently, he had been writing letters to about 210 women. They believe he killed about 55 of them in his lifetime, making him one of America's first serial killers in the 20th century. He was executed here in Moundsville, West Virginia, and he is still buried just outside of Moundsville at our prison cemetery called Whitegate Cemetery. So we actually have the grave of a serial killer here in Marshall County. But they switched over to the electric chair in 1951. The first time that was used, it was used twice on the same day. Fred Painter and Harry Burdett went to the electric chair within minutes of one another. They actually beat a man to death over a flask of wine. They'd been drinking that night. Mr. O'Brien wouldn't share his wine, so they beat him to death. They stomped him to death. And they were executed, the first 2 to test out Old Sparky. Old Sparky was actually built by an inmate named Paul Glenn. Paul was a carpenter, but nobody had ever seen an electric chair, so how do you get an electric chair? Well, they sent him to Columbus, he studied their electric chair, witnessed an execution, came back here and built Old Sparky, that is still here and on display in our lobby. You can imagine Paul was not popular among his fellow inmates and peers here in this prison because of that. So they had to send him to a different prison. But the last man to be executed inside this penitentiary was Elmer David Bruner. Elmer Bruner was apparently a rough character who had been in and out of prison his entire life. In the 1930s, he had served time here previously. But he apparently tried to break into a woman's house, Mrs. Ruby, and found out that she was there, which he did not expect. As he remembers it, he says he struck her once and he ran, taking her car keys. But as the actual court reports dictate, and as they actually found on the investigation, he beat her to death with the claw end of a hammer before he stole her car keys and ran off trying to steal her car. Elmer Bruner was executed here in 1959, and he was the last man in the entire history of the state of West Virginia to receive the death penalty. Still to this day, West Virginia does not have capital punishment. So, this is the only history of capital punishment, is right here where we're looking at, where this building used to sit. 1967, they tore it down. James Burkhammer was an inmate that was actually sentenced to die by the electric chair, but after the death penalty was abolished, he had to have his sentence commuted over to life in prison. And he lived until 2001 when he finally passed away. So he was the only inmate on death row at that point. So these bullpens were put in after that. Now there was a very interesting story that we had always told. Has anybody been here before? Have you ever heard the story of the wagon gate and how people think they did executions there? Well, that's false. They never did any executions in the wagon gate. In fact, we still have a noose hanging in there. You're more than welcome to go in there and check out the first floor of the wagon gate. I just ask that you don't go on the stairs or on the upper floors. It's in too bad a shape. We can't let anybody go up there because they very well could fall down through the steps or even the floor. So don't try and go upstairs, but you'll see that noose hanging in there. That trap door was just used to store large objects up there. They would hoist freight up through the floor by a pulley system to store it up there when it came in by the truckload. So that's why that is there. Now, back in the back corner, very brief story before we head into the cell block. At they actually used to have a women's housing unit here because this was not always an all-men's prison. We housed about up to 100 women here at a time before they were moved to an all-women's prison called Penn Springs. But one of the women we had here was Kathleen Maddox. She robbed a gas station and was sent here. Now, she had a young son who was sent to McMecken to live with her parents, his grandparents, and he was partially raised in this area, going to school in this area, playing with local kids in the neighborhood. And you may know this man by the name of Charles Manson. Charlie Manson's mother was an inmate of this penitentiary, and his uncle was as well. And he was partially raised in Marshall County, and even have pictures of him at the age of 19 at a Halloween ball up in McMecken with some of the local girls. Now, Charlie Manson was never here, but he wanted to be. He wrote a letter to the warden in 1983 asking if he could be transferred, and the warden told him that he would come to West Virginia again when hell froze over. And I guess that didn't happen because Charlie Manson was never here. He passed away late last year, coming up on the 1-year anniversary of his death here in a couple months. So, but he was always in California, never here. You can read that letter though, by the way. I don't know if anybody saw it in our museum. We have it on display. You can read a real letter, handwritten by Charles Manson. Any questions? So let's head into the cell block. Watch your head. You're a little taller.
Sorry.
Sorry. All right, everybody inside?
We got everybody.
As long as you're inside the cell block, that's fine, and you can hear my voice. You are now inside North Hall cell block. This was segregation. This was punitive and administrative segregation, also referred to as lockup. Now, the inmates called this cell block the Alamo because they said every day that you lived in this cell block, you would have to fight for your life. There was a lot of violence in here, and in fact, just in the last 9 years, I'm talking 1986 to 1995, we had 16 homicides inside this cell block. On top of that, 20 cases of attempted murder. And on top of that, 11 suicides, all in 9 years. It was the most violent cell block in the history of the West Virginia Penitentiary. This was where a lot of the clashes between the gangs were carried out. Now, it was difficult for them to carry these violent attacks and beatings and stabbings out simply because they were locked inside these cells for 23 hours a day. Segregation meant they were in there by themselves. They kept them apart from every other inmate 23 hours. And in fact, they were fed 3 meals a day through the hole in the bottom of the door, which was called the bean hole. The correctional officers had to pass that out to them on the inside of the cell. This first tier that we're looking at right now, mind you, this is what was called B block. So you have A block and B block. B block, on the first tier, they called this administrative segregation aggressive. And what that meant was it was the most violent inmates in this penitentiary that the administration had deemed to be unable to be housed in general population. The inmates had a more simple name for this. They called this the animal tier because they said this is where the animals lived. This was the most violent gang leaders, the most violent killers, all kept on one tier. The very first 4 cells you walk past that are separated even by this doorway, they were kept separate because they were the gang leaders. They were the violent inmates as well that they could not trust even to have contact with the rest of this block. They showered separately, they went out to recreation separately, and you all probably saw the very first cell that you walked past. It's almost instinctual. You have to look inside that first cell, right? It was the one that said Aryan Brotherhood on the wall. Everybody saw it, right? That cell belonged to an inmate by the name of William Red Snyder. Red Snyder, actually, at the time of his death in 1992, was the leader of the Aryan Brotherhood gang inside this penitentiary. Red Snyder started in this penitentiary in 1965 for larceny. When he was released after 24 months, he went home to find out his 15-year-old sister was having a relationship with a boy that was over 18. And he was furious. This caused him to go into a homicidal rage, which claimed the life of his father. Red's dad was actually shot in the head with a high-powered rifle, and then this boyfriend was shot in the chest with a shotgun. Red also kidnapped his entire family, though, which was 8 kids and both parents. So, Red was sentenced to the West Virginia Penitentiary for 2 life sentences without mercy. He would never get out of prison, and in the time that he was here, he was convicted of 3 more counts of first-degree murder. That allowed him to rise through the ranks of his gang to be the gang leader. He was the most respected gang leader in this penitentiary because he was not just the gang leader that would order someone to be killed. If he had to, he would get into the trenches himself and carry out that murder personally. Red had a best friend named Rusty Lassiter. Rusty was basically Red's protection in his later years. Red had had a heart attack in the early 1980s, and he was not as strong as he used to be. But Rusty was there to take care of him because Rusty was stronger, Rusty was younger. But in November of 1992, they had a falling out. And when they had this falling out, they were no longer friends. And it just so happens the man that lived right next to Rusty in cell 18, just behind this fence, it's the one that's painted blue. His name was Elijah Sarton, and he put out a kill order on Red Snyder. Rusty Lassiter was the one that took up that kill order, and on November the 16th of 1992, when their doors opened, Rusty ran into Red's cell, pushed Red down on the floor, and stabbed him 37 times in the chest, throat, and face, killing him inside that cell. Rusty Lassiter laid down on the floor. He was apprehended, but they said the blood that covered that area was thick. They said it came up past the soles of their shoes. That's how much blood had pooled in that area. Now, it makes sense. The reason he died is because he had so many stab wounds all over him, including his throat, that he bled down into his lungs and he drowned, and then bled out the rest of the way. Now, that is believed to be the most haunted cell in the West Virginia Penitentiary. Red Snyder is probably the most talkative, the most active spirit, if that's what you want to call it, the most intelligent entity, sometimes referred to as, in this prison. People have actually captured full communication with him using digital voice recorders, EVPs. Back in 2010, Rusty Lassiter, the man that killed Red Snyder, he was released on parole. A former corrections officer who knew Red, named Maggie Gray, came to the prison to go to his cell and let him know that Red, the man who violently and viciously stabbed him and murdered him, was now out of prison. Well, she went down there and she said, "Red, I have some news for you." When she played back her digital recorder after she made that statement, a voice answered her and said, "I already know." When she listened to that voice, it took her breath away because she said that was Red Snyder's voice on that recording, just as she remembered it when he was alive. Now also, she heard his voice back around 2006. She became a daytime tour guide here, and as she was walking by his cell to open up for the morning, to turn on lights and make sure the tour route was clean, she heard his voice come out of the cell and say, "Morning, Mags." She said every hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she ran out of here. She said probably the most scared she's ever been in her life was when she heard his voice come to her from that cell, even though he was dead and had been dead for years. So, Red is definitely someone you might want to go talk to. Take him a cigarette. He also liked chewing tobacco and coffee. Those were his 3 favorite things in the world. Besides that, and also the soap opera Days of Our Lives. Maybe use that. What was that? Oh, sorry, I thought you had a question for me. But the rest of this cell block is also extremely active. I have heard cell doors slamming audibly in this block, so loudly that it made people jump. Just to give you an example, everybody brace yourselves. I'm going to slam this door. I've been giving the tour. This is probably about 2 months ago I last heard this. I was talking about Red Snyder actually when it happened, and from the upper tiers, which are locked off, nobody can get up there because of the structural instabilities of that part of the cell block. It sounded like somebody took one of the doors and just slammed it shut that loud. The woman jumped that was standing next to me and screamed and then looked at me like I did. I'm just as shocked as you. But that's not the only time I've heard it. I've heard it 3 times. At the end of the cell block, these tables were put in originally for them to have recreation, but after a few times when the inmates could not be trusted, since these tables are behaving themselves and be civil to one another, they basically only allow them to have outdoor recreation, and that's it. After that, the tables were utilized for the officers to prepare the trays. They'd have the styrofoam trays set out, the food would come down from the dining hall, the big serving cups, and then they would portion that out onto the trays for the inmates, and then pass them out to them on the inside of the cells. 3 times a day. Pretty tedious job. You'll get used to it by the time the night's over. Now, you were in the administration building. The first floor here was used for different administrative purposes. The post office was over here, and the commissary was over here. The commissary was where the inmates would purchase things like chips, candy bars, tobacco, cigarettes, magazines, playing cards, snacks, whatever they wanted to get there. So this used to be the original entryway to the prison, and the front door is straight through here. This was a revolving security door called the wheel, and this ensured that nobody that wasn't allowed to be in here entered the West Virginia Penitentiary, and nobody that wasn't permitted to leave left this penitentiary. So it revolved on a belt system, which hooked to the top of the wheel that hooked to an electric trolley motor and spun this around in both directions. This is pretty unique because when it was installed, there were only 2 of them in the world. One here and one in Manchester, England. So it's a pretty neat structure. We do have it locked up though, so nobody can get upstairs, because the upstairs is the part that's in really bad shape. So that is why that's there. Now we're going to move down to the basement here in a minute. I tell the story up here, and I'm sorry to tell you this, I tell the story up here because when we get down to the basement, there's always so many bats down here that I can't get a word in edgewise. Everybody's ducking and jumping and jiving and laughing, so
Oh my God.
I'm going to tell the story up here, and then we'll just walk down through there. I'll show you where this happened, and we'll walk back up out. Now, down below our feet, directly below our feet, was where the boiler room was. The boilers were put in the 1950s, and they needed to have a man who took care of the boiler maintenance, who kept the boilers fired, fed them coal, and made sure they didn't malfunction, and also kept track of the boiler maintenance. They chose an inmate named R.D. Wall, Robert Daniel Wall, and he had a living quarters right below us and over here behind him, in that area below that part of the administration building was his living quarters. Now the other inmates were really upset with him because of the privileges he was given. The jealousy set in, and a lot of them were pretty accusing of R.D. Wall. They thought he was an informant. They thought he was a snitch. And apparently they thought they had found evidence that he was a snitch. Because on October the 8th of 1979, 5 inmates snuck down here in the early hours of the morning, and they slaughtered R.D. Wall in this basement. Just below our feet, R.D. Wall was stabbed more times than we can even count. He was partially skinned alive, and they partially decapitated him, left parts of him spewed all over the room. So it was a very violent and vicious murder, and down there they believe R.D. Wall still resides and still communicates with people. So let's walk down.
Yeah, it sounds like they filleted somebody down here. Oh, God damn it. It's like an old medieval dungeon.
Steps are all the same length of them.
Oh, this is where the dude sit at the outside the gate.
Yeah. Yeah, this is where he didn't like. He was fine in other places, but he didn't like it down there.
I guess you can't really blame him. They're like, once you get down there, sit in silence for 5 minutes. I'm like, okay, yeah.
He had to get inside the. Didn't he have to go inside that thing?
Something like that.
Wait, didn't he stand like? Did he stand right here? Isn't this where he stood?
He stood outside the gate, yeah, like I'm down here.
Yeah, he was supposed to go.
We're all going to be friends by the end
It's
of this.
supposed to be over there. Maybe. I thought maybe we were supposed to go in here.
This place is creepy.
All right, now, just so we can get through here and get out of here, let me go ahead and get into the stories. This is where R.D. Wall was murdered. Now, I told you when we were in the Sugar Shack that there is a place that is darker than the Sugar Shack, and we are actually in it right now.
Yeah, wow, that's
You can see the only illumination is that LCD screen that he's got there. Welcome to the party, Bat. Now, it is believed believe R.D. Wall actually resides down here. People have captured his voice in this basement area. People have seen shadow figures and possibly even his apparition.
Nice.
It's always an interesting thing to talk to R.D. Wall, asking him about his job, his living quarters, what it was like when he lived down here. People seem to get responses. But one weird thing about this area, now it's kind of hard to tell because of the bats flying around, but even in the middle of fall and spring when none of the bats are out, people will claim that something touches them down here. We've had reports of, especially women, claim that something plays with their hair. that something or someone will play with their hair. Or even finger will run down their arm, and even this happens to men, poked on the shoulder, poked in the back. So, but, everybody ready to move upstairs? Yeah. All right, let's head out of here.
I know that was struggling.
Yeah, go ahead.
Luckily, that's
Does that go back in?
Oh shit. Is that all water?
Yeah, wash it. Water.
Yeah.
Dude, is there a hole in the ground down there?
I don't know. No.
I bet you do. I bet you know it's back there.
What's this? They held
Is
coal.
that where the shower was?
They probably held coal right there.
Ghost rat.
a great trail.
Yeah.
Hello?
My main problem is I can't see where I'm walking. This is nice. We should come here. Oh yeah. I think you could get some stuff up here. I feel like the things are inquisitive. They want to know who you are. Bunch of people in their medical rooms. Ooh, man, my breathing is labored up here.
What?
My breathing shifted up here. Oh yeah, this is definitely a spot. Where? Huh. That's what I remember this from. Ghost of Ghost
What was that?
Adventures, a bat.
A bat?
Ghost
Oh, I seen it
Adventures.
flying, yeah.
Ghost Adventures was in here,
Yeah. Is he in that room?
and one of their people was in here, and he was walking, and he fucking freaked the fuck out because a woman, like an apparition of a woman, appeared.
It's crazy.
Yeah, that area, this area is active.
This would be a nice place to do solo.
Yeah, walk to that shit. I mean, I'd be nervous. I'd be nervous anywhere, though.
Especially everything having new spirits in here.
Now this room was a little different. This room was also lined with beds, but it was not for overnight medical observation, it was for psychiatric observation. This was Special Programs Unit, the SPU, or the Psych Ward as it was also called. The inmates in here at times had to be four-pointed. Their arms and legs were restrained from the bed because they could become violent at any moment towards themselves or others. In case of an inmate that was violent towards others for no reason, he was borderline, if not fully schizophrenic. He was usually in a good mood, but he would start to pace in small circles. As he walked around in a circle, the circle would get bigger and bigger. And if the officer wasn't paying attention, when he got close to the desk the officer was working at, he would punch the officer in the face. There were a couple officers that had broken jaws from this, and ended up, they let the officer up here have a nightstick so that when the inmate got close to the desk, they would slam the baton of the nightstick down on the desk, the inmate would giggle and run across the room and jump back in the bed.
I'll beat him when he's in the bed,
Some of them
too.
were grotesque, some of them were violent
Fucker in line.
cases of psychiatric disturbance out here, one of which was of an inmate whose name no one has ever been able to recollect, but everybody tells me the same story. That's how I know it's true, but I can't figure out what inmate it was. He was in here for life without mercy, apparently, and he was wanting to get out of here. He kept telling the officers on this floor that he was getting out of here today, that he was going to be getting out of prison today. He was getting out of prison today, and they constantly assured him, "You're not getting out of prison, by the way." Now, he said, "I'm getting out of here today with one swift motion,
Yeah, it keeps coming right in front of me.
I see it.
Back in March of 2009, I heard what sounded like somebody fired off a shotgun. That's the only way I can describe this. In this
Pretty loud.
It was so loud I felt the walls vibrate. I felt the sound waves hit me in the face. I felt it move my hair. That's how loud this was. I captured it on my audio recorder, and when I played it back, sure enough, you could hear what sounded like a plastic and metal shotgun shell hitting the concrete. And then beyond that, after the blast and after the shotgun shell, there was a man's voice that showed up on the recording, and it said, "I told you not to make a move." So, and I've never been able to explain that away. I think that is a residual experience, a residual deep activity, but still, nonetheless, very creepy. Now, beyond this, in the very next area, we're going to walk straight through and down the stairs, but when you look to the room on your right, as soon as you walk into this hallway, you will see 2 cells. Those were the suicide watch cells. The inmates that had been threatening suicide or displaying signs that they were contemplating suicide, or even some form of psychosis that was violent toward themselves, they would strip them down naked and lock them in those cells. Those cells have been the center of some of the previous activity in this prison. One of our tour guides, Lori, said she heard what sounded like somebody was inside one of them with a baseball bat trying to beat the door down. The cells are locked up. You can't get inside of them. And in fact, they have been locked up from 1995 until 2012. Nobody could open them. So we keep them locked up. Definitely walk into that room with the cells are in later on and try and get back to it.
If you'd like to know more about Epoch Paranormal, you can find me on Twitter at JosephSturgill7 or on Facebook at Epoch Paranormal. And most importantly, subscribe to my YouTube channel, Epoch Paranormal, for more videos of the paranormal, EVP, and parapsychology. Thank you.